you're like me, you have difficulty learning geology from a book. I recently had the opportunity to hike the Escalante route with a graduate geologist from Northern Arizona University, Billy Woods. We began our trip at LePan Point at the trailhead of the Tanner Trail, hiked down the Tanner, spent the night at Tanner Beach, then the next night just past 75 Mile Canyon, the third night at Hans Creek. At that point, Billy and Rick hiked out the Grandview Trail, and Mark and I continued on to Grapevine Creek, Cremation Creek, and then hiked out the South Kaibab. The first leg of our trip from the Tanner Trailhead down to Cardenas Butte was quite steep and a little snowy.
So we're in the Grand Canyon, right on the Tanner Trail, and standing right on the trace of the Butte Fault, one of the most important structural features in the eastern part of the Grand Canyon. And as we can see, this panorama back here, what we see directly on the right here is the upper members of the Hermit, sandstone, shale, whichever you'd like to call it. And on the left, we have some really good exposures of the Coconino sandstone. And this dichotomy is really important because it tells us age relationships between these two units tell us that there's a significant fault here. The Coconino is about 290 million years old, a Permian unit. The Hermit Shale is about a 320 million year old Mississippian unit. And for these two units to be directly next to each other topographically, there has to be movement on one side. So as you can see on the right here, the Hermit Shale has moved up to be juxtaposed directly across from the Coconino sandstone. And we have about a 50-meter subsidence here. So this fault has created about 50 meters of movement. To the north of me here, we got the desert, the Palisades of the desert, which is a really tremendous erosional feature capped by the Kaibab limestone on the top and punctuated by the Redwall limestone, two major cliff-forming rock features here in the Grand Canyon. And that's about a 4,000 foot sheer cliff and is a really unique view here in the Grand Canyon. You can't see this from everywhere. So that's one of the things that makes this trail special. For those of us walking through the Coconino sandstone, one of the most interesting features of this rock is the cross-bedding, where basically each bed runs into each other and truncates at an angle, and we interpret these as big old sand dunes. And the wind was traveling this way, and then it switched to traveling that way. So this is something that we don't see super often here. This is a mineral called calcite. It's pure calcium carbonate. And it's sitting right next here to a piece of Redwall limestone, which we just hit the contact of between the Supai group and the Redwall limestone here about halfway down to the river. And this mineral is what makes up this rock. It's a carbonate limestone, and water has moved through this rock and deposited this beautiful mess of calcite for us to enjoy right here. Like that, a surface was eroded off the top, and the tapetes represents like a proximal marine sandy beach area. So that was laid down, and all that happened over about 1 billion years, but there's 500 million years of time missing right there. So that's really important. The great unconformity. So we're sitting here in some awesome narrows, and this is really high-grade metamorphic quartzite. That's metamorphosed sandstone, very high quartz silica content. So what you're seeing on your big, beautiful screen right now is a number of us climbing the Papago Wall. It's the big cliff at the end of Papago Creek that drains right into the Colorado River. And this cliff is made of quartzite. And the reason that it forms these cliffs, this very abrupt, steep cliff, is that it's a metamorphic rock. That means it's very much harder than your typical soft sediments or even some volcanics. And it's actually the same stuff that we saw in that slot canyon yesterday. So right behind me, framed beautifully between this canyon cutting down, is one of the most prominent features that you can see from the south and the north rim, Shiva Temple. And these temples are really great examples of how the Grand Canyon erodes. All the drainages that come down and filter into the Colorado River take all the rock and sediment with them that's been piled up here over billions of years. The streams cut down and they differentially erode through each unit, and eventually, over time, things as the rivers cut down into the drainages, they build up these big temples, and big blocks of rock fall away from each layer, and leaves you with something like that. So off in the distance here, across the river, once again, we have the Great Unconformity, and it's very, very apparent here the inclined beds of the Grand Canyon supergroup juxtaposed against the flat-lying sediments of the Tepete sandstone. And basically what an unconformity is, earlier I talked about how 500 million years of time is missing. An unconformity, and particularly the Great Unconformity, is an erosional surface where there is a gap in the rock record, or quote-unquote missing time.
Billy, I was curious, how old is the Grand Canyon, roughly?
Well, that's a point of hot debate, but the most accepted age is about that it started forming about 5 million years ago, and it took about 1.5 million years to actually start looking like this. And basically, the Colorado River, big picture, has cut down over the last several million years to form all of this, call it the Colorado River and all of its little tributaries. But the action or actions that occurred to allow that to happen have to do with tectonics, and most specifically the East Kaibab monocline, or the East Kaibab uplift, which caused a flexure in the topography, lifted up the earth, made a swell sort of in the middle, such that the river would start cutting down. Now, before that had to happen, there also was a release of water. The main prevailing theory, based on gravels and evaporite or salt deposits up in Utah, suggests that the Colorado River was not always a river. The Rocky Mountains formed about 65 million years ago, and so they've always drained to the west. Since they formed, that water had to have somewhere to go. Well, it went down, and the prevailing theory is that it collected in these lakes in south and central Utah, and at some point, due to likely tectonic activity, tectonic uplift, of which there's several in Utah, allowed the river to be released and just flow down to this way in succession with the East Kaibab uplift, cuts down, and that and all its tributaries formed the Grand Canyon. And again, based on different volcanic rock ages and ages of gravels that have been deposited in saline evaporite deposits up in Utah, the idea is about that all that started to coalesce about 5 million years ago.
Awesome. Thank you.
After saying goodbye to Billy and Rick, Mark and I continued along the Tonto Trail to a spot just on the other side of the canyon from Grapevine Spring. Our last night in the canyon was spent at Cremation Creek, which had a beautiful view of the North Rim. Finally, we hiked up and out the South Kaibab Trail on an extremely windy and cold day. Thanks for listening and watching. If you're interested in hiking the Grand Canyon or other interesting geological spots in the desert Southwest, get a hold of Billy Woods. All of his contact information is in the show notes below.